Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is July 27th, 2012, and my guest is Roger Noll, professor of economics at Stanford University. Roger, welcome to EconTalk.
Thank you.
You've been a central figure in the application of economics to sports, and that's our topic for today. I want to start with an area you've written widely on, the financial impact of sports teams and sports stadiums on their communities. What do we know about that? What have we learned over the years in analyzing those effects?
First of all, it depends on the kind of facility. That an arena that has multiple uses, say it's going to have a basketball team and or a hockey team, has other potential uses like concerts and tractor pulls,
rodeo,
all kinds of stuff. And so a well-managed arena can be occupied 250 to 300 nights a year, and they can break even. And indeed, if I don't think there are very many cities out there who regret having built an arena, unless the city next door also builds one, and then you have two that are half occupied. Yeah. So there, you can't really argue vociferously against building an arena. Baseball and football stadiums, however, there aren't any that have been substantially subsidized where the local community has received anything remotely resembling a reasonable return on investment. They are financial black holes. Especially football stadiums.
It's only 6 times a year, at best, 5 times a year. 8, excuse me.
Yes, then they may make the playoffs.
Right.
And then you've got a couple of preseason games. So
True.
Give them 10
12,
or 11.
Yeah, we're really got on a limb.
So, even in the best of circumstances, what you've created is something that essentially sucks the blood out of a neighborhood because it's so rarely used. And indeed, they create slums as opposed to being engines of growth. And cities who put in hundreds of millions of dollars into football stadiums inevitably find themselves with big losses. Baseball is not quite so bad because it's
81.
Yeah.
Or a few more.
Yeah, 81 plus games per year. But the problem with baseball has been that the owners have realized that it's a really bad idea to have Fenway Park, where all that concession money walks across the street to the bars that are not part of the Red Sox empire. So the modern version of a baseball stadium essentially is a baseball field, the stands, a shopping center, and then acres of parking to make certain that no one can ever go anywhere else.
Yeah, so that's Turner Field, that's the
Miami is the best example because not only when you get past the parking lot, then you got to cross a freeway to get to anything else. So what that means, again, is that the facilities that used to have some spillover benefits to the neighborhood no longer do.
So it's even a harder case to make, yeah.
Yankee Stadium, for example. It used to be the case there were memorabilia shops and bars and things like that adjacent to Yankee Stadium. They've disappeared.
They're all inside the stadium.
They're all
Yankees
inside
are capturing
the stadium.
That
exactly.
revenue, yeah.
So the bottom line to it is cities should not subsidize baseball and football stadiums if the goal is engine of economic growth or financial benefit. Now, since I don't have anything against San Francisco subsidizing the opera, I can't say, therefore, it follows you shouldn't pay the money at all. But the decision to pay the money should be based purely on having it in the community because you like it, as opposed to it's going to return some great financial bonanza.
Yeah, it's embarrassing to say, but it's a special interest group called sports fans who, and the cronyism of the owner who often is generating the political support for those subsidies.
Well, the political support is the sports fans plus the construction industry and construction unions plus the banks who are going to handle the financing. You put all those together and you're typically up to 20 to 25% of the vote. Now you got to get another big hunk of votes in order to get it past the electorate. And that's where the economic development argument comes from, is that if people vote purely on the basis of shall we throw $1,000 per capita at a sports team, they'll generally say no unless you can convince them they're going to get a return on it. And the way you get up to over 50% support is to promise them that it's going to be an economic benefit.
You're talking about situations where there'd be a public vote on whether to subsidize the state, which is not always true, though.
It's not always true, but usually it is. Hilariously enough, there's a great quote from the mayor of a town in Arizona, which says, we always put it to a vote. If the people say yes, then we build the stadium. If the people say no, we build the stadium anyway.
Yeah.
But usually there are votes, and indeed the frequency of winning the votes has gone down dramatically in the last 15 years. My favorite vote is when the good citizens of my former home, Pasadena, voted 80-20 against giving the Rose Bowl to the NFL. So there's hope.
When you say giving the Rose Bowl to the NFL, what do you mean?
They were going to spend approximately $350 million to renovate it so it would have NFL standards, which means lots of luxury boxes, and then give it to the NFL rent-free.
To attract
a pro football team to Los Angeles.
And they voted, yeah. So they, despite the claims, I'm sure there was an economic study that showed all the multiplier effects, but despite those claims, the electorate was not convinced. They they need to study more econometrics, Roger.
Well, the Rose Bowl, the city of Pasadena turned out to be against it, and that the economic development argument didn't wash.
Let's talk about the sports industry in general. It's changed incredibly as an economic phenomenon over the last 30, 40 years. Let's start first with labor relations. So the relationship between the players and the owners and both the legal environment and other factors have changed that tremendously. What important, how would you summarize the importance of what has changed, and why did it change in terms of the labor relations?
Well, of course, the crucial fact about labor relations is that all sports have attained some degree of free agency. That is to say, once a player plays a certain number of years, they qualify to be part of the normal labor market. And, at the time this was being advocated, economists had written as early as in the 1950s that there was no good reason in an economic basis for the reserve clause, the player reservation system. The owners had responded by saying it would destroy professional sports to have a labor market for sports. And indeed, in the 1970s, they all got free agency and we have no sports left.
Yeah, well, they were right. Yeah. They were so precious.
So the very first question to ask is, what was the effect? And the effect was roughly to double the fraction of revenues that went to players, from in the range of 25 to 30% to in the range of 50 to 60% of revenues in all the sports now go to the players.
Which is closer to the in the national income accounts, where it's 2/3 pretty much historically.
Yeah, the sports industry probably would have an even greater percentage of its revenue going to labor in the absence of the restrictions that remain.
The draft, for example.
Because there's no capital investment. If cities give you a stadium...
Well, that's a good point. Yeah, how you measure those fractions, obviously, there's accounting issues. Yeah,
yes,
good point.
The fraction of income going to players would be substantially lower if they had to pay for their stadiums, but they don't. So...
Typically.
Typically. There are a few that do, but mostly they don't. So what that basically says is that the market worked, that teams didn't spend themselves into oblivion. The second issue, of course, was the reason that free agency was supposed to destroy sports as we know it today was the issue of competitive balance, that the Yankees would hire all the best baseball players and the New York Giants would hire all the best football players.
Green Bay would never.
And yes, Green Bay would
Milwaukee,
be unable to compete. Any small town with a small market would be unable to compete.
There's some truth to it. There's some truth to it.
There's sort of the first obvious empirical point is that in no sport has there been a clear reduction in the degree of competitive balance, measured any way you want to measure. It's kind of a difficult concept to quantify.
Sure.
Because does it mean the difference in the quality of the best and worst team in a given year?
Probability of winning, is it equal for every team each year? Is there no dynasty?
Right. Does it mean multiple wins? Is it the same teams in the playoffs or different? You can imagine a world in which the best team wins 75% of its games and the worst team wins 10% of its games, but the identity of those teams changes from year to year.
Correct.
And so different teams win the championship every year. That could still be regarded as balanced. But it turns out it doesn't matter how you measure it. That the presence of dynasties, that is, teams who persistently are in the championships, get to the semifinals or finals of the end of season tournaments, or the spread in the won-loss records between the best and the worst teams. All the measures of competitive balance say that it's at best no difference, and in a few cases it's gotten more balanced. Like baseball is definitely more balanced now than it was, and the NBA is more balanced because just before there was free agency, the Celtics won 9 years in a row. Yeah. So the prediction that this would lead to competitive imbalance was false. And then we can ask the next question is why? Because economists happen to have been right about this one. We have very few victories where we actually predict the outcome correctly. So we're going to have to trumpet this one.
Which part of it, though? The one part you already said. Obviously, the economic prediction would be a shift in revenue toward the players because of competition, and
that was
happened.
Correct.
Although some, I'm sure, could have argued there's not enough competition. It's still a limited number of teams, but a surprisingly large impact for some people. But there's definitely been an impact.
Yes, the question is, why would one not expect that the degree of competitive balance would be pretty much unaffected by player market rules? And the answer to that is that who owns the right to the player, whether it's the player or the team, doesn't really matter in the long run, because if a team is more valuable in another city than the city in which he's currently playing, he'll end up getting either just transferring because he gets a better wage offer, or being traded or sold. All right, and that was the thing that convinced the early sports economists like Cy Rottenberg, who wrote the first important paper on the economics of sports in 1956, that was the ability of the Yankees and the Dodgers to retain high-quality teams by simply buying players from other teams. And indeed, in the 1950s, we can recall
Kansas City Athletics.
After the Athletics moved to Kansas City, they basically became a farm team for the Yankees. So that insight, which is called the Invariance Principle, that's what Rottenberg called it. 4 years later, Ronald Coase wrote his famous paper and called it and we all call it the Coase theorem. But the basic story of it is, in the absence of some significant market failure, one doesn't expect the initial allocation of an asset to determine where it's actually going to be used in the long run.
The only thing that changes is who captures the benefit.
Exactly. The only thing is the transference of income.
Resources flow to their highest use.
Or at
least there's pressure on it. Now, Coase said if their transaction costs are too high, that might not happen, so you then would care a lot about what the initial...
Yeah, I mean, most people who cite the Coase theorem get it wrong. They get the sign wrong, because what the whole paper is about is all the ways it might not work.
Correct, I know. No, it drives me crazy.
So we'll call this the anti-Coase theorem.
I said it drives me crazy, but it also drives Ronald Coase crazy. We just interviewed him recently. I just interviewed him recently, and it drives him crazy too. Okay.
Yes, I know. And I was at his 100th birthday party, and so
He's doing great.
Drives him crazy. But the insight is still valid. Can we identify the common sources of market failures that would cause what is called the Coase theorem not to be true in the baseball players' labor market? And the answer is no, because it's a fairly atomistically competitive market in which you're making bids for players who have well-known track records, and their values are well understood.
Although there's, of course, the irony about it is that we talked about Kansas City. The Kansas City Athletics in the 50s sold a lot of players to the Yankees.
Yeah.
The Oakland Athletics became a team that was known for trading players and then sell them. Sometimes they did, but they often traded players to more upscale market teams for prospects and draft picks and other things. Not draft picks, prospects typically. And if you're astute, as Billy Beane was, at least for a while, and still is, you can.
They're doing it with this year with smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, my sons who are big fans of Moneyball said, "Do you think he's got a new trick? It could be, or it could be lucky. You know, there's all randomness in all activities like this, but who knows?" But my point is that there are a lot of intangibles that they can't. What's great about, I think, what makes baseball and especially so exciting and interesting as a fan is the incredible amount of statistical evidence we have, and that's improved, and we've gotten better at understanding it. But there's still these things that can't be measured: how a player is going to perform under pressure in a bigger market, and psychological issues. So there's still these imperfections that either lead to random outcomes or astute outcomes that we don't know. But.
Well, the probabilistic nature of sports is, I think, a major source of interest in it, right?
Sure.
It's not going to the ballet.
Right.
It's not going to the opera where you know that
who's going to die at the end.
Who's going to die at the end.
No, that's what makes it exciting. The unpredictability.
So the unpredictable aspect of it, but in terms of, you know, a baseball player who is going to come up to bat 500 times a year, you have a fairly good predictor of how much he's going to contribute to the team, and I think that's the crucial part. The market has a lot of information
Correct.
in it,
no doubt,
and a lot of people in it on both
but
sides.
They have a lot.
And apropos Billy Beane, I mean, the interesting thing about the A's is, of course, that they not only sell players, they buy players.
Yeah.
They sell the expensive ones and buy the cheap ones. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. In years, you know, if what he's doing is taking a player who's got 5 or 6 years worth of experience, who's about to come to free agency, and selling that player for the purpose of acquiring a bunch of minor leaguers who still are 2 years away from the major leagues, who have the same expected value,
right,
but they're not certain, then every so often he's going to do extremely well.
Yeah.
Every so often he'll do very badly, like they did a few years ago. Yeah. They did exactly the same number the last time they sold off all their stars, and it didn't turn out well. They ended up with a team that was below 500. Now it worked. The last time they just sold off all their players a couple of years ago, and these kids have turned out to be stars. So,
right. There's always, as you say, it's a small.
Yeah.
If you had 500 players to do it over, you get a certain expectation. Yes. When every year it's 3 or 4 or 6.
But it's only a small number, yeah. So it's, I mean, I think that the main difference, of course, between Oakland or Minnesota or some of the other small market teams is that the only game they can play is the lottery on young players, and so you're going to see them rise and fall in the standards if they play their cards right, and some years they're going to have really good teams. By contrast, if you're a team with a lot of money, like the Yankees or the Dodgers, and you're not in the pennant race, you've made a big mistake because you have much less variance.
Yeah, that'd be the Mets, for example, who spent a lot of money and had very little to show for it.
Historically, until recent years, Texas was that way. They spent lots of money for no apparent purpose.
Well, it's because there's people make mistakes.
They make mistakes.
Obviously, and there's a random element. And, you know, there's an interesting question of whether, I interviewed Michael Lewis on this. Mm-hmm. I asked him why he thought, Billy Beane told his story publicly, right? Mm-hmm. He had a market advantage, and he revealed it.
Yeah.
And it's clear that market advantage has shrunk, his insights into on-base percentage and other things that gave him an edge. One hypothesis would be simply that people would have figured it out anyway.
Well, they had.
Or that they had. But Michael Lewis's view, which I don't know if it's accurate or not, but his view was that Billy Beane felt that baseball's old-fashioned. These people are not going to pay attention to it anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And I think he was partially right. I think
both stories are true.
Correct, because I think some owners, I think this was Michael Lewis's point also, the younger owners who are less traditional and have other motives and other things going on, were much more open to hiring statistically sophisticated general managers, whereas some of the older ones just stayed the way they always had, hired their friend or somebody who's got a track record that maybe not so accurately predicted.
No, I think that's right. I think that to get to the point, I think that the teams that were going to change their management strategy and adopt an econometric approach to how you hire players, those teams had already learned the lesson, and by the 2000s were already doing it. Yeah. And then the other set wasn't going to change anyway because they're more traditionalist.
Now, as a sports fan, one of the things that's frustrating is the perpetual drama when there's a new labor contract. Happens in football, happens in baseball, happens in all the major sports. And there's a threat of a strike, a lockout, other things that go on. Is that going to just keep going?
Yes.
It can't seem to get better at that. Yeah, explain why.
There's two reasons. At the heart of it is that sports unions are inherently extremely weak.
Sports unions?
Yes. And the reason they're inherently weak is the median voter in the union is somebody who expects to have only 1 or 2 more years of playing career. And so if he loses a year, he's lost
a huge
50% of his future lifetime income by losing 1 year. So players' unions have a very difficult time keeping the union together during a lockout or a strike. Given that, owners periodically take runs at breaking the union, and they usually can succeed in getting significant givebacks. Most collective bargaining agreements have the property that in them is a big short-term giveback, and that eventually sort of disappears because the way the agreements are written, it's sort of like a one-time hit, but they don't change the trajectory. And so within a few years, you're back up to where you were, and it's time for another one. It's also abetted by the fact that because of our wonderful tax laws, which create a huge financial incentive to sell teams after you've owned them for 7 to 10 years, the characters on the ownership side change dramatically between collective bargaining agreements, and you get people in there who think that the previous owners were just stupid, and that they can do better. And so you find really aggressive new owners coming in saying, no, if you guys had just hung in there, we could have broke the union and gotten back down to the 25% payroll that we had in 1965.
And these are also owners who are coming from industries where they've been successful. Obviously, they have to be very wealthy, where the labor management relations are very different, the competitive environment's very different.
And that brings up the magic question, which is the subject of my most recent paper.
Fire away.
Which is, in Europe, sports unions are close to non-existent. In the United States, sports unions are extremely visible and seemingly quite effective.
And sympathized with by the public, I would add.
And sympathized with the public. But in Europe, 3 times as many people belong to labor unions as in the U.S.
In the outside sports.
In outside sports. So this presents a puzzle.
Yeah.
Why is it the case that the only powerful unions left in the U.S. are government workers and sports, whereas the European economies remain highly unionized no matter where you are? And the reason for that is antitrust. That antitrust is an out for a union in the United States, and it's really not in Europe. That private antitrust is almost non-existent in Europe. It's beginning to come into existence, but in Europe, almost all antitrust cases are initiated by the government or the European Union. All right. Whereas in the United States, almost all antitrust cases are private.
Private meaning initiated by a private.
Right. It's 2 private parties litigating. So if I think you are engaged in a monopolistic practice that hurts me, I can sue you. Whereas in Europe, there's some opportunity for that, but the vast majority of cases, it's the government investigating somebody. And there have been a couple of antitrust cases in Europe, but they're much less frequent and much more difficult. And in particular, one thing that you cannot do in Europe is commingle labor relations and antitrust. In the U.S., the law has this process called decertification, which is a union can convert itself from a collective bargaining union to simply a professional association like the American Bar Association or the American Economics Association, and thereby become just an aggregation of private actors, in which case the antitrust laws apply, and the new organization, the professional association, can then sue the employer if that employer engages in anti-competitive practices. The reserve clauses, the restrictions on the player markets that exist in all the sports, once you get outside the context of unionization, are antitrust violations. The only way they could be converted into something that is exempt from the antitrust laws is through a collective bargaining agreement. Only labor, organized as a union, has the power to grant an antitrust exemption to the employers for collusive behavior in the labor market. That is an extraordinarily powerful weapon. And so you have this wonderful, if you read carefully the articles about impending lockouts and strikes, like right now in the National Hockey League, what you read is the owners want a union and the players don't. Now, that is really a very strange circumstance, but it's driven by a peculiar legal institution in the United States, which is labor unions in sports have something to offer that is extremely valuable to owners, which is the antitrust exemption, particularly the antitrust exemption of the rookie draft, the cap on rookie salaries, things like that. If the league attempted to do that outside of a collective bargaining agreement, they would be thrown out as an antitrust violation.
So, which is weird because, we could spend the rest of the time on this, and I don't want to, but I just want to mention it. A sports league is a weird thing because you can't play on your own. You need an opponent, and you need the drama of the competition. So you need other teams, unlike a business. You can't just say, I'm going to start a sports team that just wears the uniforms and wanders around. It has to have opponents. So this league is this weird thing. It's the league itself.
Well, there's always Notre Dame.
Yeah, well, we're going to get back to Notre Dame. We're going to get to Notre Dame in a minute, but basically you've got, you have to have other, whether you're in a league officially or not, you do have to have other opponents, and then, but at the same time, each team's trying to win. Each team's owner is trying to maximize its profits, but if you maximize your profits on your own and you drive all your opponents out of business, you don't have a league anymore.
But that's not the profit maximizing solution.
Obviously. So there's this weird mix of, you have to collude in some dimension. You have to build a schedule. You have to have...
That's not collusion, though, because it has no adverse effect on the market. The definition of an anti-competitive restraint is one that reduces the efficiency of the market, not increases it.
Yeah, I'm using collusion in the everyday sense of the word, meaning get together to plan stuff.
But there's lots of things where that analogy breaks down, all right? First of all, the teams don't have to own the league, and indeed in most of the world they don't. That is to say, the football league in England, which is the second, third, and fourth professional divisions, is a separate legal entity from the member clubs. Mm-hmm. All right. And indeed, throughout most of sports in most of the worlds, leagues are separate. And in the United States, NASCAR is separate from the individual teams that race in NASCAR events. Likewise, racetracks are separate. So there is no good reason why you can't have competition in the team market and competition in the league market. The NCAA is organized as a series of conferences that compete with each other. The NCAA gets in trouble when it tries to override the conferences and make rules that apply to all colleges.
But it has lots of those rules, obviously.
It has lots of those rules, but it's lost a lot of legal battles about them too. Most important being when it lost the right to sell broadcast rights for all of colleges, which are now sold by conferences. So, yes, it's true that there has to be an entity which you can think of as a standard-setting organization. You can think of the NFL as the IEEE settings. The IEEE sets standards for computers to talk to printers. All right. So you need a standard-setting organization.
Because you could have rules that each team some rules that each team lives by.
Exactly.
How big your field is.
And then the question is, when does the necessary standard-setting activity
where does it end? Yeah.
Stop and spill over into anti-competitive market restrictions? That is the interesting question. And with respect to player market rules, the economics research is virtually unanimous. Nothing is ever unanimous in economics, but as close to unanimous as you can get that the player market restrictions are unnecessary for the financial health of leagues. Although it is definitely true that teams are worth more if they can restrict competition in the player market.
It's back to your old point, right? Mm-hmm. It's a question of who's going to capture the gains.
It's who gets the gains.
Yeah. There's a lot of things I want to ask you about on that, but let's move on, because there's a lot of other.
We could go on forever on that.
That's a good one.
Yes. Yeah.
Let's talk. You mentioned college sports, the NCAA. I want to talk about that. We have a very weird thing to an economist. It's not so weird to the general public, although they're starting to think it's a little weird. We have a system where young men and women, mostly young men, produce millions and millions of dollars of profit and revenue in a few sports. I think mainly two, mostly. There are exceptions probably on certain campuses. But in general, football and basketball, especially football, produce enormous amounts of revenue for the college writ large. They play for free, other than tuition benefits and food and lodging, but they don't draw a salary. There's tremendous restrictions on what they can do with their time during those 4 years, and often longer if they're redshirted or other things or injured. They can't work part-time on the side because that could be a source of bribery. They're forced, if they want to retain that scholarship, and in some sports is their only way to the professional, generally almost the only way to professional careers, they have to practice it. Shocking, I think, again, to the non-insider, it's shocking what their workload is like day to day.
Yes.
It's not just the games and a little practice on the side. They're weightlifting and training year-round. And because of what economists would call rents, the profits that are generated from that activity, there's still competition for those that takes place in stadium construction, payment to certain coaches. And as a result, we've had recently, especially, a set of very ugly scandals in college sports. Recruiting is a perennial problem in terms of so-called cheating, which is an inevitable example of resources trying to flow to their highest valued use. But they don't flow very easily to the athletes. They flow to others, typically the coaches, I think, and to the universities. And we have this horrific Penn State scandal, which is, I think, tied in pretty obviously to this phenomenon in some dimension. Where do you see this heading? What, if anything, might change? And what, if anything, might we do to change it? I'm not sure it's changeable, or whether it's wise to try to change it. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, this is another topic that could go on for several hours. And so I'm
giving you about 10 minutes, right? I know. I have other questions.
Let me just start off with sort of the obvious point, which is the price of virtue is going up extremely rapidly.
Yeah. It's costly to be a good guy.
20 years ago, it cost you a few million to be a good guy. Now it costs you a few tens of millions.
Yeah.
All right. Now,
because you're foregoing
the amount you're foregoing, let's start with the factual base. All right, the factual base is not quite the way you characterize it. That it's only about 50 universities that make a lot of money on their football team, and it's a somewhat larger number, but still less than half of the Division I basketball teams that make money. The rest of them do not generate this huge surplus.
They're trying to get it, but
they're trying to, and indeed, every so often, a school that you haven't really heard of will suddenly burst forth.
Boise State,
yes, or Gonzaga in basketball.
I think the same thought. Yeah.
And they will do very well, although their time on the stage usually is short. Sometimes they make it permanently, but usually it's a coach or two, and then they fall back because they don't
cheating. They lose the coach to it. They lose the coach to another.
They either lose the coach or they're found to have cheated. All right. So what the NCAA has done is organize itself in a way that allows, for the most part, flagship state universities, which start with a huge fan base because such a large fraction of the people in the state went there. Yeah. And indeed, including a good fraction of the state legislature.
Went there, No, it's a terrible public choice problem, is the way I view it.
Exactly. Yeah. And so you have this enormous political base to make the University of Nebraska be a great football power, or University of Oklahoma, or the University of
Michigan,
Alabama.
LSU, Georgia.
Yes.
They're all the large. People don't notice this. Large state universities, which seat 90 to 106,000 people, are
have 30 to 50,000 students, have hundreds of thousands of alumni, and can pack a football stadium 80 to 100,000 for every single game.
And people can't figure out why Notre Dame isn't what it used to be, but it's pretty obvious why it's not what it used to be.
Exactly.
That can't access the public purse.
It's too small.
Yeah.
And it's too small.
Yeah.
See, Notre Dame suffers from the same problem Stanford does, which is
high standards of academic.
You have a high academic standard in a fairly small alumni base, and Notre Dame has done far better actually against the onslaught of the big state university than anybody else, frankly.
USC is the only other name you could think of, really.
Yes.
Duke in basketball, which is a relatively cheap sport. But in football, it's
for the most part. If you look at the list of the perpetual top 25 teams, it's mostly these big flagship state universities, and a very large fraction of them are not the academically top flagship state universities. And so these are institutions whose public visibility and political popularity hinges more on their athletics than on their academics and what goes on them as universities.
So I interrupted you. We were talking about the NCAA's role in this. Go ahead. But that part for me, the part you mentioned so far, is the willingness of the legislature to tolerate all kinds of things and encourage funds going to these things.
Well, yeah, and then, see, in theory, the NCAA is an organization of university presidents. That's in theory what it is. In practice, at most of these institutions, the director of athletics is a more powerful person and a more highly paid person than the president of the university, and has enormous local political influence. And for the most part, there are exceptions. The directors of athletics are the ones who run the NCAA, and they run it for the benefit of the Department of Athletics. What that, of course, means is they like having as many sports as possible, because the bigger the enterprise, the bigger the budget, and the more important they are. And they also organize things to benefit the coaches as well, because they're also extremely powerful. The revenue effect on coaches' salaries is enormous, because what you're hired to do as a coach is primarily to recruit. That's mainly what it is. There are people out there who are really good coaches, but
if they're not good recruiters, ain't gonna.
If they're not first-rate recruiters, they're not going to have a top 20 team. And so what the nature of the market for players is about is everybody has the same price tag. It's going to cost you one scholarship, and everybody has exactly the same price tag. You as a coach, if you're really good at recruiting, you're the guy, you spend exactly the same amount of money as the guy who's no good at recruiting, but you get a bunch of blue chippers and your team is much better and generates a lot more revenue, and then competition in the market for coaches causes you to get all that reps that would have been paid to the players.
Yep, sure.
And so we are now in a world, as you say, if we go back to 2000, it was unusual to have any coach make more than $1 million a year. Now we have a whole bunch of them making $5 million. All right, and it's just going to continue that way. That we have gotten ourselves into a situation in which we start out with a lot of universities having their future depend on their political popularity, and their political popularity depends on the quality of their athletics teams, especially football and or men's basketball. Yep. then creates this other environment where the athletic directors and the coaches end up running the university, and they are the main beneficiaries of all the money that's coming into the sport.
You mean it's not run for the student athletes? Yeah, that's shocking. So a school like Stanford, we're sitting here on the Stanford campus right now, and Stanford is, as we said earlier, rather exceptional, yes. Unusual in its ability to compete at the national level in college sports and across a very wide array of college sports. Little known, it does exceptionally well in a bunch of sports that people don't pay a lot of attention to,
yes.
but in the ones that they do, football and basketball and sometimes baseball, they've also done quite well while maintaining standards. And I taught here in 1986 and was fortunate enough to have members of the Stanford baseball team in my economics class. They went to they won the College World Series that year, and they came to office hours. I mean, they didn't have people paying to take tests for them. And Stanford has very high standards. Is that an aberration or a model?
It's an aberration.
Yeah.
And the reason for it is the Stanford recruiting problem is to identify a very small fraction of the kids who are going to play at the highest level of intercollegiate sports who also are serious academics.
Yeah.
All right.
There aren't enough of those to go around.
I mean, my friends who are interested in sports economics who teach at universities are insanely jealous of me. My summer RA this year is an undergraduate athlete who's running regressions for me.
Yeah. That's not common.
And and the thing is, what Stanford did a long time ago was not try to hide the fact that you have to be a student here. Instead, to try to use that as a recruiting advantage. And as a result, by just telling kids right from the get-go, the reason to come here is because you don't want to be just an athlete. You want to be a multidimensional person, and you want to be a good student, and you've been a good student. And that works for a small fraction. But the number, like in a typical year, the number of students who play football who could get admitted to Stanford is in the range of 70 to 80, and we have to get 25 of them.
Yeah.
And so if there were more than 3 or 4 schools out there trying to recruit it this way, we'd all be toast. Yeah. We couldn't possibly compete.
Yeah. So you started off by saying virtue's gotten more expensive, and you talked about a change from 2000. That's, I assume, driven by ever larger TV contracts and bowl payouts.
That's exactly right.
Corporate sponsorship and
the huge run-up in both the March Madness, the NCAA basketball tournaments, both men's and women's. Women's is now the same thing. I mean, it's behind.
Yeah.
But women's basketball today is more popular than men's basketball was 15 years ago. So women's basketball is rapidly entering the same domain of the price of virtue being high. It's nowhere near men's basketball, of course, or men's football if you're at the top. The BCS conferences in football. So you have this huge engine that generates enormous amounts of money, and basketball is especially profitable. If I don't know if you heard the story a couple of years ago about the $1 million free throw. All right. The $1 million free throw was one of the small schools. I think it might have been, it was the one from the Colonial League, which was, an accidental entry into the NCAA just because it won its conference tournament, but it wasn't a top 100 team, managed to win its first round game at the end of regulation, a kid was fouled shooting, and if he made both free throws, they would win. And indeed, he made both free throws. That caused the payoff to the Colonial Athletic Association from the NCAA basketball tournament over the next 5 years to go up by $1 million because they got one extra game. You get
wow, that's mind-boggling. It's incredible.
So the bottom line is each conference gets a share of the NCAA basketball revenues that is determined by the total number of games they played in the tournament in the previous 5 years. And so one game is now worth closer to $2 million.
Wow.
So when you put that much, now think about how that translates into the pressure on the kid and the economic incentives to be sure you have a kid up there at the free throw line who's going to make the free throws.
Yeah, that kind of sums it up. And it explains, it's always been obviously true, but it's even stronger today that being a coach of where your economic well-being depends on the performance of 19-year-olds under pressure is a tough life. You can see why they're a little bit. It draws an unusual type of person into that world. It
does, and it's not. It's interesting to observing the Stanford coaches. They have from their perspective, it's a really tough thing because on the one hand, they know that the expectations of them are not as high as they would be if they were at Alabama.
Right.
On the other hand, they know that the recruiting problem is infinitely more difficult, and it's not an easy life. They work very long hours.
Yes, they do.
And it's a tough job. And I don't begrudge them their success, but there again, we don't keep our coaches because we don't pay $5 million.
Right.
So when they come, they come, they fail, they get fired. They come, they succeed, they go on to somebody who will pay them more.
Yeah. Let's shift gears. I want to talk about steroids and performance-enhancing drugs. One way to enter this discussion, I'll start with this question, is should Barry Bonds be in the Hall of Fame?
If I had a vote for him, I would certainly vote yes, because the incremental value of performance-enhancing drugs, no matter what the truth is behind the story of Barry Bonds, is minor. And but I think that's not the interesting question.
Good. It's a shocking answer. I'm with you. We're very most sports fans and certainly most sports writers do not agree with that. But,
I know.
But I agree that my view is the impact is small. The statistics that suggest otherwise are not very persuasive.
Well, you ask yourself the question, prior to the slightest hint there was any use of performance-enhancing drugs by Barry Bonds, what kind of a baseball player was he? And he was a Hall of Fame quality baseball player.
Yeah, now, you can debate whether, if he lied under oath or did other things, that should keep him out of the Hall of Fame. But on the field,
I also favor Pete Rose going into the Hall of Fame.
Right. So, but you're saying that's not the interesting question. So what is the interesting question?
Well, to me, the interesting question is we have taken something that is borderline criminal behavior and delegated to a private organization the responsibility for defining what is legal and illegal and for inflicting the punishments. And to me, that's reprehensible.
I kind of like that, Roger. I'm going to have to disagree with you there, but go ahead, make the case.
No, here's the reason for it is that the World Anti-Doping Authority is an entity that earns its bread by ever expanding the list of things that are banned and testing for them and punishing people for them.
You're talking about
incentives are wrong.
You're going beyond baseball here. You're talking about cycling, Olympics,
the whole banana.
Okay.
It all flows.
It's all the same.
It all flows from this superstructure that's been created, and if you drill down and you read the decisions of about athletes, a very large fraction of these cases are for ridiculous things, right? Because they have way overdefined what's a performance-enhancing drug. And so they're doing enormous harm.
First explain the incentives for why they've expanded the list and why that's bad. So start with, what are the incentives for the people in the organizations?
The problem that athletes face is twofold. The first is that you can go into a restaurant and have a meal, and it's possible that a standard ingredient in that meal is going to cause you to have a positive drug test and to be punished for it. All right. So, and that's because the criteria for deciding what is a banned substance is, does it have, the first point is it possible that there exists a dose of this that would be performance enhancing, and B, can we test for it?
Okay, so I agree that's a stupid rule, but why would they have that rule?
And the reason they have that rule is because the World Anti-Doping Authority basically charges a piece rate. The fees you pay for that institution to exist and be out there catching the bad guys is proportional to the number of bad guys they catch. And they have, what's been happening, it's been delegated to these entities that are not part of the sports,
okay,
to decide for us what's legal and what's illegal and what the punishment is. It's not being decided in a mechanism whereby the best interest of the athlete has anything to do with it, or the best interest of the sport has anything to do with it.
But many people would argue, and I'm not one of them, but many people would argue that it's in the best interest of the athletes to not have to deal with the temptation to tamper with their bodies in unhealthy ways. So this zealousness is a good thing because it reduces this private incentive, this arms race between athletes, that they all start taking the steroids and they're not getting any edge from it. All they're doing is hurting their bodies. So that's the argument for making them banned.
The very first question to ask yourself is precisely, what is the steroid problem? Is it steroids? Because, like, for example, a few years ago, my wife had a frozen shoulder, which meant she couldn't play golf anymore. She went to the doctor. She got a steroid shot, one single steroid shot. In a couple of weeks, it cleared her up. She'd go back and play golf.
And she's hitting the ball a lot farther? No, she's not.
No, she's not.
And I think that's a myth, but more or less.
No, I mean, the point is that a lot of the banned substances have important and beneficial medical uses, and there is a medical use exemption, but it's extremely difficult to get.
So let's get away from this international issue, which maybe we'll come back to, but let's just go to baseball, where there is not an outside body that's imposing rules and regulations on the players. This is in theory, because of the labor union and the owners' incentives, they have both. Somewhat, there's conflicts sometimes between them, but they've got someone's looking out for the players in some dimension. It could be public good problems, collective bargaining problems, but someone's looking out for the players. Certainly somebody's looking out for the sport. In my view, which might be similar to yours from what you're saying, is that they just should have left it alone. If people want to take steroids, they can. They'd find out maybe that they work or they don't, but it should be a private choice and no one should be tampering with it, but that's not the way they went.
No, I can see why you wouldn't want to do that. I mean, I think it's possible to design a perfectly rational drug program, but the way it would have to be done is precisely focus on the activities that would be a prisoner's dilemma. That where
there'd be a conflict between your self-interest and
where where a situation in which everybody feels the need to engage in behavior that is self-destructive.
So do you think steroids is that case?
I think in some cases, yes, but much more limited than what the rules we've made against it. And I think that the problem stems actually from a bigger problem in sports, which is the leagues and the teams have screwed things up pretty badly by the way they approach the medical care of players. The steroids problem is nowhere near as big a problem as the dementia problem for football players.
I agree, which is coming big time. It's starting to, in the last 2 years, become salient, and it's growing.
And it's a big
damage
deal.
Yes. Head damage from collisions.
The damage from collisions, the permanent bodily injury that's being done to football players is growing because the game gets faster and the players get bigger and the hitting gets worse. The leagues have not attempted to adjust the rules to diminish it.
They're starting to, but
like for example, rugby players and football players play a similar game, and they have similar physical attributes. They're big, they're fast. NFL players wear a missile called a helmet, and rugby players don't. And rugby players don't suffer from these problems, and football players do. So now
it's the greatest example of economic thinking in action, that sometimes called the Peltzman Effect. You put the helmet on to protect yourself, it makes the game more dangerous.
Exactly. And so it's the box we're in is that we start off with the players not willing to trust the league and the owners because they know that they don't take care of them, right? That the short-term incentives to win today's game tend to overshadow the long-term incentives about the player's health, and that gets in the way of attacking the drug problem in a sane way, which is to focus on what the problem is as opposed to just have public relations driven rules that make you get by the sports writer who doesn't think very deeply about the problem and just thinks all drugs are bad.
Right. So if you had your druthers, you would liberalize the rules of steroid use and other
I would liberalize them to some degree, but what I would do...
Weightlifting, my favorite. Would you allow players to lift weights?
What I would do is, it seems to me that the athletes should be able to make the rules. And whatever rules they want to make, that's okay, as long as it's legal. I mean, I don't think they should engage in illegal activities. I would rather fight the marijuana battle in Congress than fight it in the NFL Players Association. But within the constraints, once the rules about drug use go beyond legality, then I think basically should be the players who decide. And the problem, I think, it's not just professional sports; it's worldwide. That's why I go back to WADA. The athletes have almost no role in defining what the boundary is once you get past legality. And that's what's causing the problem. That's why we have over-enforcement, why we don't focus the energies on taking care of the things that are genuinely a zero-sum game problem or a negative-sum game problem, a prisoner's dilemma problem. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to do that, but I do not think that the current system is a valid solution to that problem.
So let's talk about the owner's incentives. I've heard on talk shows recently, and I think this is going to grow, retired athletes asked the question, do you want your kid to become a football player? You know, a great football player who is a Hall of Famer or a future Hall of Famer is asked, do you want your kid to be a football player because it's dangerous? And we've always known it's dangerous, but now it looks like it might be more dangerous, and
it's becoming worse.
It's becoming worse. The owners have an incentive. The owners have an incentive there because they're going to have to might have trouble attracting skilled young people into their sport.
And that's happening.
So they do have an incentive to fix it, but it's a long run incentive. So.
Well, and it's probably too long run, in the sense that the time horizon of owners in all professional sports is really quite short. It's a few years.
But at the same time, as a fan of the sport, many of us are going to be, if not already, uncomfortable enjoying watching people hurt themselves in ways that we think might make it difficult for them to enjoy their grandchildren. Circus
Maximus.
Yeah, and I think that is a short run incentive that's going to push them. Where do you think that's going to turn out? What do you think this? Let's start with football. What do you think football is going to do with this problem that you got very large people at high speeds running into each other and hurting each other? It's always been true. It's just that the hurt's getting bigger.
My expectation is that the NFL will be very slow to deal with the problem, that it's more likely to be dealt with at the college level than at the NFL level.
Although there may be some legal pressure on them, I think there could be some lawsuits that's going to push
I agree that the big wild card, there's, 40-some lawsuits now out there against the NFL from retired players. Yeah. Yeah, but the issue is, what will the financial hit be? It could be awfully big.
Yes, it could.
And of course, that if it is really big, then that would provide them with an incentive to change their behavior. But right now, prior to that, first of all, it's not at all obvious to me that the retired players are going to get a big payday from these lawsuits. Then the second part of the story is, I think you're right that the demand for not just football but all professional sports has increasingly had a violence component to it. I mean, the hockey is the same problem. Basketball is a very different game now than it was 25 years ago.
Much more physical. Many more injuries, by the way, too. It seems to me.
It's not a game that, as somebody who has played basketball all my life, it's not a game I would want to play if I were 20 years old, the way it's currently played.
Do you think you would have said that when you were 20 years old?
Yeah, because I didn't like violent sports as a kid.
How tall are you, Roger?
6'5".
Okay, so Roger's 6'5", I'm 5'6", so it's a
Your basketball career was short.
Short. Yeah. we're taping this in Roger's office, and we're sitting down, so the differences are still visible, but not quite as dramatic. So you played basketball your whole life. By the way, did you play at the what level of
I played in college.
And where was that?
But I was at Caltech. It was nowhere.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, but they made a movie about it. But
they did?
Yeah, Quantum Hoops. Go see Quantum Hoops.
Oh, cool.
You can rent it.
Yeah. What's that movie about?
It's a movie about Caltech basketball.
Are you in it?
I'm sure am.
Cool. Let's close. We're just about out of time, and I know you've got to go play basketball today. Roger told me that he plays every day, and I'm sure it helps keep him fit. Close by talking about sports in our lives. I'm a sports fan. You're a sports fan. But my children's experience of sports is different than my experience as a child because of the wall-to-wall availability of sports coverage now on the web, on TV, on the radio. It's a part of our lives, and it's part of our culture that it was not 30 years ago, 20 years ago, maybe even 15, 10 years ago. Why has that happened? Why has sports become so interwoven with movies and day-to-day life in a way that it wasn't before? Well,
the very first obvious point is the growing capacity of the media to deliver content. And sports is zero cost because it's already being produced for another purpose. So you can fill up television with all kinds of sporting events that are not major league professional for virtually no costs, and so that makes it ubiquitously available. But the interesting thing is, I think another big change from when I was a kid versus now is how organized the participation is for kids. That when I was a kid, all sports were completely informal. It was going to the schoolyard and playing in the school.
Playing around.
Playing around. And I played it as much as my grandchildren play, but I never had the degree of organization. And I observe this, my daughter and son-in-law are constantly talking to me about, at the level of 10 to 12-year-old kids,
travel teams,
the intensity of coaching, the travel, the formal organization, the quest for financial sponsors. I mean,
it's all part of the same phenomenon we've been talking about.
It's all part of the same phenomenon, and you have guys out there who are dealing with 10-year-olds as if they're coaching in the NFL.
Yeah.
And that intensification of it.
But that's because of parents who imagine their kids might get that payout down the road.
Exactly.
That
they want their kid to be able to, their goal is to bring their kid to the level that they can make a high school team and then hope that he'll get a scholarship to college.
Maybe get drafted.
Yeah, exactly. And even in a community like Palo Alto, which is, the top of the income distribution, the top of the educational distribution, you still have that. You still have this intense desire, on the one hand, of parents to have their kids be quasi-professionalized at age 10, and then the coaches feeling the pressure to win.
Now they have a data point, right?
Yeah.
Mr. Lin was right, was a Palo Alto High grad, I think.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
NBA star, and that's people are often fooled by one data point.
That's right, and I have enormous respect for Jeremy Lin. I think it is a great story.
No, it's a beautiful story.
But the reality is that is such a ridiculous long shot.
Yeah.
For anybody to change any of their behavior on the basis of that is ridiculous.
Right.
But in any case, I believe that the commercialization incentive has permeated all the way down, and I don't see it being as much fun.
Yeah.
The notion that we engage in sports for an entertainment and a recreation has been largely displaced by it being a job, even for kids, and I think that's crazy. But it is driven by the same market phenomenon. And it's going to get worse before it gets better.
On that cheerful note, my guest today has been Roger Noll. Roger, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
You bet.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.